How's it going, my fellow Frosties? Today we have a video outlining the basics when it comes to Frostmage in Mythic Plus. I will be going over talents, legendaries, rotation and more. I'm fairly new to YouTube at this point, but you can always catch my stream at twitch.tv/Okaymage. I stream most push weeks and the shenanigans in between. Before I start, I would highly recommend you check out Grinder's Mage Sims. He's one of the clever math mages over in the Autotime Mage Discord. I'll provide links to both in the description below. You can see the DPS rankings of all three mage specs in regards to things like covenants and legendaries. You can choose how many targets. There's a ton of useful information here. It's something I personally refer to on a regular basis. He works hard keeping it up to date, so be sure to have it bookmarked. First things first, let's kick things off with talents. Lonely Winter is what you want on the first row. It increases the damage of your Ice Lance, Flurry and Frostbolt. Next up, the favoured talent on this row is Shimmer. It turns your blink into Shimmer, which allows you to use it while casting. You also gain 2 charges as opposed to 1. It's worth mentioning, I have come across people who prefer Ice Flows, which once activated allows your next cast to be castable while moving. One good thing about Ice Flows is that Blink in its original form does actually break you out of stuns. This can be quite useful in niche situations. I wouldn't recommend taking it because of how strong Shimmer is, plus Ice Flow's movement capabilities lessen as you gain more haste. If you do want to take this talent, it's your choice. It's actually pretty good on Sludge Fist as a niche tip. Rune of Power will always be the talent to take on the next row, with the exception of if you are focus magic trading with another mage. What I mean by this is you and another mage both take focus magic and put the buff on each other. It gives you both a flat extra 5% crit chance. In addition, it gives you a further 5% crit and a 5% int proc whenever your partner critically hits something. It's not viable for fire mages, but it is a DPS increase for frost mages to trade this with one another. Bear in mind, this only applies to single target. In any multi-target scenario, you proc your Icy Propulsion Conduit enough that focus magic isn't worth taking over Rune of Power. I know this is a Mythic Plus video, but I just wanted to make sure I covered all the bases to make things as clear as possible for any new Frosties out there. Anyway, the chances of getting one Frost Mage into a key is one thing, let alone 2. Moving on. Chain Reaction is the next talent you take. It's a stacking buff that increases your Ice Lance damage with each shattered Ice Lance. Considering our damage breakdown, this row is self-explanatory. I often see people ask if they should track this buff in order to maintain it. The answer is, Chain Reaction is completely passive. It should be ignored. You don't need to panic throw Ice Lances to extend it. The next tier is situational. Ring of Frost has a lot of utility uses. However, if you don't have much experience in Mythic Plus or know what you would use it for, I'd only take it if your group asks for it. You can take Frigid Winds if you need the extra slow, otherwise you're safe with Ice Ward to get bonus crits for Icy Propulsion. More on this later. As for the next row, Splitting Ice is the go-to talent in all situations, even single target. Freezing Rain always sounds like it's a good idea. It often catches out new players with the instant Blizzard cast. The reality is that it's actually a DPS loss. No matter how convenient it may sound to you, please do not take this talent. Splitting Ice all the way. Lastly, Thermal Void is too strong right now with the Icy Propulsion Conduit. Thermal Void causes each shattered Ice Lance to extend the duration of Icy Veins. When I say a shattered Ice Lance, I mean with either a Finger of Frost proc, following a flurry with the Winter's Chill debuff on the target, or a hit on a rooted Frost Nova target. Next, I want to quickly talk about stats. The most common question when people start out with a new spec is, what stat percentages should I aim for? Now, I'd really like to clear this up once and for all. I have seen far too many mage guides at this point, and each one makes the mistake of giving its audience false stat weights and percentages. This is spreading misinformation and is incorrect. The truth is that there are no specific percentages of stats to aim for. In the wise words of Grinder, the thought process behind this question is simply a misunderstanding of how stats work. In a modern day WoW, stats generally complement each other, and the stats for Frostmage in particular are a little closer than some other specs. You need to equip the gear that gives you the most DPS, found through simming your gear, with almost no thought on what stat percentages that leaves you at. In other words, stat percentages do not matter. There are very few stat percentage breakpoints in the game that are of utmost importance. In these rare cases, the trusted guides, usually found in the class discords, will tell you about it. So with all this said, the most accurate way to see what gear is an upgrade for your character is to sim each new piece of acquired gear. Before I get onto simming, let's talk about what stats to look out for on your gear while you're playing. Crit, Haste, and Verse are all good for Frost. The spec basically favours anything other than Mastery. Even if you do get Mastery, however, on some pieces, it's not the end of the world, it still does something. Due to the large intellect stat budget on items, item level will be an upgrade most of the time, even if the item has Mastery. So sim, sim, sim. It's also worth saying here, and I see this far too much, changing your gems enchants from one stat to another will not make you do substantially better DPS. People put far too much emphasis on stats in modern day WoW, when in reality, it's the buttons you press and how you press them that will actually make the difference. Marginal stat differences won't save you. Optimizing your movement, dealing with mechanics well, maintaining uptime, not cancelling casts, will all improve your DPS. Not just changing a stat gem. Frost is in fact a rare spec that does actually contain a soft cap, which is a 33% crit soft cap. Contrary to belief, you do not need to reach this 33% crit. It's merely a soft cap, not a goal. Why is it a soft cap, you ask? Your passive, Shatter, multiplies your critical strike chance by 1.5 and adds 50%. At 33.34% crit, your chance to critically hit frozen targets is 100.01%. Quick math. So what happens if you do go above it? This is my single target crit scaling. You can see that I'm basically right at crit cap, and the value of crit drops rapidly moving past that. So once you reach the soft cap, you gain very little from crit, and you should aim for other stats. It's worth noting that this is for single target. Looking at a 5 target fight, you can see that it's actually fairly constant. It still has a change in slope, but not nearly as much. Meaning on multi-target it's still not as valuable, however it's definitely not as dead of a stat as in single target. Without the Glacial Fragments legendary, you probably still don't want to go over the crit cap too often though, so bear this in mind. Like I said before, the most important thing for you to do is sim your gear. With the wide variety of gear that's available, and the RNG required to get some bits, a modern day WoW character's gear setup will be pretty unique. Because of this, it's very difficult for anyone to tell you what will be an upgrade for your character personally. For example, due to your gear setup, your character may gain more value from haste than someone else's. So please, please, please always sim your character using Raidbot's top gear. The website is very user friendly, it's not as complicated as simming used to be back in the day, and it definitely won't bite. As a side note, don't ever use stat weights. This will change every time you get a new piece of gear and it ends up being a total headache. Just keep things simple and accurate by simming top gear every time you gain a new item. This will always accurately tell you what's an upgrade for you. So, how do you sim for AoE Mythic Plus? For starters, always use Patchwork fight style for any sim that you run, whether it be single target, AoE or any of the raid encounters. Mage APLs aren't built for hectic ad cleave, dungeon slice, light movement and the rest. So please always select Patchwork to make sure the sim gives accurate results. Mythic Plus is a little bit tricky to sim for currently as there are no reliable ways to sim it. You will have to run a few different sims in order to recreate various scenarios in Mythic Plus and use a bit of common sense when looking at the results. To recreate a very generic trash pack in a Mythic Plus dungeon, you could sim Patchwork 4 or 5 targets, 40 to 60 seconds, Bloodlust off. It's worth noting that this short time can make certain things seem a lot stronger. For example, some trinkets will sim best in this scenario because it's short burst, but what you have to bear in mind is that you won't have that trinket off cooldown for every opening on every trash pack. This short time also won't properly show the value of some spells and abilities like Icy Propulsion, so bear this in mind as well. You could up the time of the sim to 2 minutes to gain some value out of Icy Propulsion and certain trinkets. You could also up the time to around 5 minutes to recreate several pulls in a row through a dungeon. These are the sims I tend to do. However, like I said, run a few different settings and compare the data. On to the next point, Legendaries. The 2 legendaries to focus on in Mythic Plus as of 9.0.5 are Glacial Fragments and Freezing Winds. Glacial Fragments offers insane consistent burst AoE. Craft it in your leg slot with crit haste. Freezing Winds gives you more priority target funnel damage, which we all know are what Frost Mages excel at. Craft it in your head slot with crit haste. So which one should you take? Both are solid options, and it largely comes down to the situation and personal preference. So let's deep dive into them so I can help you with your decision making. There's actually not really much else to cover when it comes to Glacial Fragments. It's solid, consistent AoE, and it's great pad overall. It does, however, rely on your tank keeping mobs in Blizzard, which we all know doesn't tend to happen as much as we like. Freezing Winds, however, there's quite a bit to cover. It's less pad overall in comparison to Glacial Fragments, however it provides excellent funnel damage. As a side note, I realise I'm using the term funnel a lot without providing any explanation as to what this really means. Funnel damage basically means that the more targets you have around a priority target mob, the more damage you do single target to that mob. The way this works for Frost is, the more targets you have, the more Blizzard ticks you get. Each Blizzard tick reduces the cooldown on Frozen Orb by 0.5 seconds. The more orbs you get, the more Fingers of Frost procs you get, and the more single target nuke you gain with each proc. Getting back on track, Freezing Winds also provides strong on-demand short bursts on things like Pride. It's also great outside of AoE, such as on bosses, in comparison to Glacial Fragments. The control it gives you over target's health is also very useful. You can nuke dangerous mobs in various dungeons. You also get a lot of control within certain affixes. For example, on bolstering weeks, you can funnel into a target if its health is much larger than the rest of the pack. The funneling is also great for inspiring weeks, as you can nuke the inspiring mobs. Coming back to the question of which one to use, the unpopular answer is that it's entirely up to you. I really try and avoid these answers as much as possible, but there are occasions when multiple things are as viable as each other, so it really does come down to personal preference. As a generic rule of thumb, I tend to take Glacial Fragments in large AoE dungeons, which is pretty much all of them. The exception being Theatre of Pain, which has quite a lot of single target. You could choose Freezing Winds here. There's also a bug in the Necropolis of Necrotic Wake currently, which stops Glacial Fragments from working up there. This is the upstairs area after the second boss. So you could consider Freezing Winds for this dungeon too. I would also probably take Freezing Winds for Tyrannical Weeks and Glacial Fragments for Fortified Weeks. However, like I said, both are as viable as each other and both are extremely strong in Mythic Plus. If you have limited amounts of Soul Ash, I would personally recommend you craft Freezing Winds. This is because it's also viable in the raid for most fights. It's strong on Sludge Fist in the vulnerable phase, it's strong on 2-target fights like Huntsman, it's a legendary that can fit into more places than Glacial Fragments. Plus, like I said before, it's less pad damage and more meaningful damage. Looking at you, Mythic Stone Legion Generals. Up next is Conduits. First, we'll start with potency. For Mythic Plus, you always want to take Icy Propulsion. Every time you get a crit inside your Icy Veins window, it reduces the cooldown on Icy Veins depending on the item level of the conduit. This is the conduit that gives you the potential to have Icy Veins for every pack. Quick tip, you can Frost Nova a pack when Orb is out for some free crits. While this will also make Blizzard ticks crit in the same way as Orb, only the Orb crits will count towards Icy Propulsion, not Blizzard, contrary to popular belief. The second conduit you want to take can vary from dungeon to dungeon, and it also depends on your legendary. Unrelenting Cold, which increases the damage of your Frozen Orb, is taken for AoE/cleave. The other conduit you can take is Ice Bite, which increases the damage of your Ice Lance. This is taken for single target/cleave. When you're running Glacial Fragments in large AoE dungeons, you want to take Unrelenting Cold. For more single target dungeons, like Theatre of Pain, and when running the Freezing Winds legendary, you want to take Ice Bite. As for finesse, none of these are DPS related. However, in Mythic Plus, Grounding Surge can be extremely useful. There's a lot of things to interrupt, so the extra cooldown reduction on Counterspell can help out a lot. Flow of Time can also be useful for the reduced cooldown on Blink. It's worth noting that the cooldown on Ice Block, given by Winter's Protection, can be useful in very niche situations. Either way, these are all situational. Just like Finesse, Endurance Conduits are also not DPS related. Diverted Energy is very strong due to healing you for up to 13.2% of your maximum health if you have HP missing before casting Ice Barrier. Pyro Freeze is also powerful, as it can heal you for a large portion of your health. However, the goal isn't to sit in an ice block for extended periods of time. You can pick what suits you here. Let's move right along to rotation. Icy Veins is your main cooldown, which when used grants you haste. Frostbolt is your filler spell, which does little damage on its own, however has a chance to grant you Brain Freeze and Fingers of Frost procs. Brain Freeze grants your Flurry 50% increased damage and makes it instant cast. Never hard cast a flurry, only use it when you have a proc of Brain Freeze. When you do get a Brain Freeze proc, always Frostbolt before launching the flurry, then always press Ice Lance twice after. Flurry leaves a debuff on the target called Winter's Chill, which causes the next 2 spells on the target to act as if frozen, hence why you press Ice Lance twice after. Free procs, yay! The reason you Frostbolt before is because the 3 flurry projectiles refreshes Winter's Chill to 2 stacks, and Frostbolt hits before the last flurry projectile. Effectively, you're shattering 3 spells instead of 2. Fingers of Frost procs make your Ice Lance deal triple damage as if the target is frozen, shattering it. Use Fingers of Frost procs when you get them. You pretty much press everything on cooldown. Profit. Single target opener without the Freezing Winds legendary would be as follows. Free cast Frostbolt, throw your orb, cast Icy Veins, cast Mirror of Torment if Venthyr, throw any Fingers of Frost procs you have. Your mirrors would usually give you a Brain Freeze proc at this point, so cast Frostbolt into Flurry and double Ice Lance after, then continue your standard rotation. The single target rotation with Freezing Winds legendary is pretty much exactly the same, except it causes you to slightly delay your Mirror of Torment cast if Venthyr until you have no more Fingers of Frost procs. It usually works out about 4 to 6 seconds after your Icy Veins cast. There's a prominent question I very often see asked and rarely see discussed, which is, when do I use my second Rune of Power? This is pretty important. In general, for single target, you rune when your next cast would be an Ice Lance. For example, Frostbolt, Brain Freeze, Rune of Power, Ice Lance, and continue your rotation. Just quickly, I'd like to cover Proc Priority, as I often see this questioned. Sometimes you'll be in the situation where you have all of the procs. If you have Fingers of Frost procs, use them. If you have a Brain Freeze proc and no Fingers of Frost procs, cast Frostbolt, Flurry, then Ice Lance. If you have both a Brain Freeze proc and a Fingers of Frost proc and are not currently casting Frostbolt, use the Fingers of Frost first, then cast Frostbolt into Flurry. If you have both Brain Freeze and Fingers of Frost procs and are currently casting Frostbolt, continue the Frostbolt cast, then use Flurry and Ice Lance. Sometimes proc munching is unavoidable and cancelling casts is a bigger DPS loss overall. For AoE, with Glacial Fragments, you want to throw your orb, pop Icy Veins if available, cast Blizzard, then spam Ice Lance. Even unbuffed Ice Lances. Just spam the button, bind it to your scroll wheel and have the time of your life. Disclaimer, I don't actually have it bound to scroll wheel. You don't need to do this. If Icy Veins isn't up for a pack, the AoE rotation with your other rune would be as follows. Orb, Rune of Power, Blizzard, then spam Ice Lance again. Cast Blizzard on cooldown and spam away. Complex, I know. For AoE with Freezing Winds, you want to cast Blizzard, Frozen Orb, then Icy Veins if available. You pretty much do the same rotation as with Glacial Fragments, except you only cast Ice Lance with a Fingers of Frost proc. The Legendary will give you plenty of those to use. The AoE rotation without Icy Veins with Blizzard, Orb, Rune, and then use Fingers of Frost procs. Fitting in other casts with this Legendary can be quite tricky because of how overloaded with procs you can get. Try to weave in a Blizzard when it's off cooldown. Mirrors of Torment is generally a little tricky to optimise in AoE as you are overloaded with procs most of the time. You can use it on a priority target and follow the single target rules with flurry procs. You could also save it for things like Pride. As for Blizzard usage, the general rule of thumb with Blizzard is to cast it on 2 or more targets. You do not use it for single target. There is, however, a tiny min-max tip if you're running Glacial Fragments. On single target, you can cast Blizzard after the flurry hit from a Brain Freeze proc, then Ice Lance twice, which will proc Glacial Fragments. It's a small gain and it's not worth doing most of the time, however this is an Ultimate Mythic Plus guide, so I should include it. As we're nearing the end of the video, gosh this has been a long one hasn't it? I'd like to go through some useful add-ons, Weakauras and macros. The first add-on I would highly recommend you get is a boss notification and timer add-on, either Deadly Boss Mods or Big Wigs. You need to download both Big and Little Wigs if you choose this one, so take note of that. For the purpose of this segment, I will just refer to it as Big Wigs. The difference between them is down to personal preference. This personal preference thing again, I know, I'm sorry. DBM as a default is more in your face with notifications in comparison to Big Wigs. Big Wigs gives you a wider range of notifications by default, which is very noticeable in Mythic Plus in particular. It's also much more customizable when it comes to things like notification bars. Details is by far the best and most accurate damage meter out there. It provides a massive range of data which is helpful for analysing wipes while being easy on your CPU. I'd recommend getting the Simulation Craft add-on to be able to get your character string code to sim yourself on raid bots. You really should get into the habit of simming your character. I cannot stress enough how important this is. The last add-on I would consider mandatory, which is Weakauras. Wago.io is the central hub for all Weakauras. You can easily find ones to suit your needs. I'll personally recommend a few I find useful, and I'll link these down in the description. The first one isn't Mage specific, however it's pretty important, which is an interrupt tracker. There are a lot of casts that need to be interrupted in Mythic Plus, some of them being crucial. If you're pugging and have no comms, it's an easy way to see whose interrupt is available for these crucial casts. Most importantly, it really helps see if you are the only one that can interrupt that group killer cast. It's also great if you're in an organised group for one person to call a kick rotation. The second one I find useful is a Rune of Power tracker. This one clearly shows you the duration left, plus it turns grey when you move out of range of it. Other than this, generic cooldown trackers work really nicely. As for macros, I would recommend you use cursor macros for things like your Blizzard. This means when you cast Blizzard, it will cast it at your cursor's location. It saves you that extra click, which makes you much more efficient. Plus, this lack of downtime will add up and increase your DPS overall. I'd also recommend you get a mouseover macro for Remove Curse, which when used will decurse the player's nameplate your mouse is hovering over. There are some nasty curses in Mythic Plus, notably the Silence and Sanguine Depths. If this goes on your healer, you want to decurse them ASAP. This mouseover makes this process very efficient and quick. Questions I see asked a lot centre around cooldown usage, such as, when is it best to pop your cooldowns? And, do I need to hold my cooldowns if a boss is coming up? The general rule of thumb here is to just press your cooldowns on cooldown. I used to hold cooldowns for certain things, like bosses, however you get much less uses overall and your damage will drop. For the most part, bar some exceptions, you will only get one cooldown usage on a boss, so it doesn't actually matter whether you use it on pull or mid-fight. Getting the extra cooldown uses over the course of the dungeon has much more value. If you're in a push team, you can coordinate DPS cooldowns among you, but for generic pugging and majority of keys, you are safe to press your cooldowns on cooldown. Frost Mage's strength lies in consistent damage, and with the Icy Propulsion Conduit, you can pretty much have cooldowns for every pack. In lower keys, this might be tricky due to everything dying much faster, but that's okay. I'd also like to add, sometimes you'll be in the situation where you get Icy Veins back off cooldown while you still have the previous Icy Veins running. There isn't a downside to pressing Icy Veins again to get the rune. The only time this can be an issue is when you're running the raid single target legendary Slick Ice. It will reset you back to 0 Slick Ice stacks. Other than this, you're safe to pop Icy Veins on cooldown, mainly for the Rune of Power. Another question asked frequently is about icicles. Do you need to throw an Ice Lance when you're at 5 icicles? The answer is no. Excess icicles get thrown automatically if you're at 5 already. There's nothing to manage here at all, so don't give them any thought. What are some good uses of All to Time in Mythic Plus? There are so many niche uses of this ability, it's incredibly strong in Mythic Plus. I will be bringing out a tips and tricks Mythic Plus guide, so bear with me on that. For now, however, here are some main uses of All to Time in Mythic Plus. First of all, defensive uses to regain health after damage abilities, such as when the Shard in Halls of Atonement casts Thrash, and the Rage cast from the mob in the other side. It's also a great defensive cooldown on Pride, just make sure you let the healer know you're using it so they know not to heal you. Hello, editor's note here. I lost the footage from the end of this key, so I'm using a different the other side for the next bit, just for you keen-eyed viewers out there that notice the difference in affix and key level. My personal favourite use of All to Time is actually in the other side on the last boss totem phase. I see time and time again people asking how to do this phase as Frost. The number one piece of advice I can give is minimise your movement. If you spend all of your time dodging the circles on the floor, you're not casting Frostbolt to fish for procs, and therefore you won't have the damage. What I tend to do is press All to Time, actually soak this first swirl, then All to Time back and you don't need to move anymore. This can be risky as you need to make sure you won't die outright to this swirl, but it's one of my favourite All to Time usage. What if my tank moves everything out of Blizzard? or your healer trolls you. Tanks have a lot on their plate already. They have to decide the route and dictate the whole key while trying to stay alive. On top of that, it's more than likely they aren't going to know how every spec in the game works, let alone something that isn't particularly meta. Just kindly talk to your tank, ask them to keep things in Blizzard as much as possible, and kite through it as it's the main source of your damage. And, well, be patient. It can be tricky, but try and predict the direction the tank will kite in. It takes time over many dungeons to start learning how different tanks might approach parts of the dungeon, and then utilising that knowledge when you come across a random tank. It's not always possible, and some tanks can be erratic, but polite communication can solve this. If not, I'm not crying, you are. Thank you so much for watching my video. I mainly wanted to put an all-in-one guide together to help people. I know there's not much representation for Frost at the moment. If you found it helpful, give me a thumbs up so I know I'm on the right track. If you think I've left anything out that's important, please let me know down in the comments. There is a lot to cover with subjects like this, and I did try my best to go through it all. I'd like to give a big shout out to the All-to-Time Discord and the smart math mages over there, in particular Toe Grinder for all of his hard work. I have quoted him a lot and used his work for this video. You can find his written Frost guide in the description below. I would highly recommend reading this. I would also like to give a shout out for Collarin the contributor over there. He's someone I've worked with closely ever since BFA, and he spends most of his time helping people. Until next time, bye!